Hi everyone, Sam Pearson here. Have you ever wanted to write your own tabletop wargame? Me too. And it's 2026, so this is the year we're going to do it. This video is the start of a new series where I will be taking you through the progress of developing a wargame and hopefully inspire you to do the same, make your own tabletop wargame. And in some ways, I'm going to consider it my first wargame because while I have written some, Warcry 1st and 2nd editions, for example, and Spearhead 2, if that counts as its own game, that's working for a company. And the thing about working for a company is there's always someone to tell you what to do. We're adding monsters into Warcry, for example. So while working at a company is great, I loved working at Games Workshop, I don't think I've ever made a wargame just for me. It's always been working towards a brief, trying to satisfy the various stakeholders first and foremost. But this year, that's going to change. I'm going to write a wargame for me, and it's going to include all of the things that I like. And I'm going to aim to get it done by the end of June. And I want to challenge all of you to do the same. It's 2026. This is the year we're going to turn that dream project into reality. So this is a video series that I will be building upon every month, showcasing the development of my game. You'll be able to see the obstacles that I encounter, the trials and tribulations that I go through, and hopefully it will inspire and give you help in your own creation. You'll also get to know my game and what it's about. So today I'm going to kick off the series. This is a video about planning and concepting, but much more than that. It is a video about how to establish a cohesive vision for your game and then giving you the tools that you need to deliver on that vision. And I'm going to introduce you to my wargame in the process. It's time to explore Black Death City. I'll see you after the jump. Alright, before we begin, I want to apologise for my videos being a bit thin on the ground recently. I was planning to release this video in January and it's February. In fact, it's basically the end of February. Where has time gone? Over the past 2 to 3 months though, I've been doing something very exciting. I've been doing freelance work for the upcoming StarCraft miniatures game. This game is going to be wild, so I hope you are all excited for it. If you're a fan of Terrans, Zerg and Protoss, it is everything you could want. But it also has a really innovative set of core rules that I think will get lots of veteran wargamers excited too, including a really unique activation system. I don't think there's anything quite like it. For my part, I've been designing a narrative campaign system for the game with all of the bells and whistles. It's not the 3-location dilemma that I outlined in my other videos. That format is specifically for 2 players and is a way of teaching a games designer the importance of designing meaningful choice. This campaign is something far, far bigger in scope. It's a map campaign, and I think it's going to be the most ambitious map campaign a tabletop wargame has ever seen. Imagine if 40k Crusade had an ever-growing map at its core, where the players can each carve out their individual empires in the pursuit of resources, in this case, minerals and Vespane gas. That's all I'm going to say on it for now, but I will do a video in the future dedicated specifically to my work on StarCraft. I wanted to mention it quickly to let you all know that I haven't forgotten the channel. I've just been busy for the last 2 to 3 months and I had to put my focus somewhere else, but now I'm back. So, writing an entire wargame. This is no easy task. This is a really big undertaking, and for most that are started, I imagine very few get finished. It's important for us to say that out loud at the start and acknowledge it, I think. This is not an easy task. This is a really big undertaking. And in my opinion, there's one reason that most wargames will go unfinished. And it's not simply because it's a lot of work. If that were the case, you could grind out a wargame eventually, as long as it might take if you had the perseverance. And having perseverance is definitely something you will need, and it is going to be a lot of work, but the number one reason that wargames don't get finished, and this is really the case for any artistic endeavor, is that eventually you will get stuck. You will hit a wall and you won't know how to proceed. So in today's video, we're going to be answering 2 questions, and this is in aid of us for when we inevitably get stuck down the line. The answers to these questions are going to help us overcome those walls. The first question we're going to be answering is, what are all the core parts of a wargame? As in, what are all the things one needs to include when designing a wargame to make it function? We ask this because it gives us direction, and it means that when we get stuck somewhere, we can direct our focus somewhere else. And the second question we're going to answer is, how do I know if a mechanic is right for my wargame or not? That's the big one in my opinion, because in tabletop games design, and in all games design really, you as the designer will be met with many occasions where there are two paths you could take, and neither option is superior. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, and you need to weigh them up and decide how to proceed. This is especially true during planning and concepting. You're going to be making many critical decisions at this point. Things like, should the turn structure be alternate activation, I go you go, or something else? Should the vehicles in the game have facing and different armor values on their front and rear? And even big philosophical questions on games design, such as what should the returns on skill and the returns on randomness be in the game? So when you're faced with two paths, like you will be on many occasions, how do you decide which path is right for your game, beyond just I like this and I don't like this? How can we as games designers be more objective and choose mechanics that create a cohesive overall vision rather than a directionless mess? So that will be the question I'll be answering in the second part of this video, and I'll be using my new game Black Death City to help illustrate it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Let's go back to that first question and look at what are all the core parts needed in a wargame. I think there are 5 core parts to any wargame, and then there is an optional 6th that is in some wargames but not all. Those 5 core parts are turn sequence, combat, list building, scenarios, and setting. These are the 5 essential elements to any wargame in my opinion, and if you can figure these out, you've got a wargame, or at least the structure of a wargame, and from there you can start adding flesh to the bones. Let's look at these each now one by one. Turn sequence. This is the big one to start with in my opinion, as it shapes everything else, so that's why I'm putting it first. Turn sequence is the fundamental mechanic that structures your game. It prescribes when do players get to take their turn, and on each turn, what are they allowed to do. There are 2 big styles, I go you go and alternate activation. I go you go is where the players take turns to activate all of their units en masse, followed by their opponent, and so over the course of the round, each player takes 1 turn. Warhammer 40,000, Age of Sigmar, the Horus Heresy, Fantasy Battle, they are all great examples of this. Alternate activation is where players take it in turns to activate just one of their units, and play goes back and forth many times over the round. Bolt Action, Kill Team, Warcry, and Star Wars Legion are examples of this approach. But these are far from the only 2 approaches. There is a myriad of different turn structures one could take. For example, I mentioned the upcoming StarCraft miniatures game I have been working on. That game uses a sort of phase-led alternate activation, where the round is broken into distinct phases: move phase, assault phase, combat phase, with different actions you can perform in each phase, but it uses alternate activation within each of those phases. So for example, in the move phase, players alternate taking moves with a unit one at a time. It also has a unique twist in that whoever finishes all of their activations first, either because they've activated all of their units in the phase or because they've deliberately chosen to stop early, that person gets priority and gets to go first in the next phase. Because this is such a big topic, I have my own video dedicated to this. Link down in the description below, and I'll also post a link at the end of this video. Now, each approach has different pros and cons. I go you go gives a game a more strategic feel because you get to pull off these grand maneuvers, activating all of your units at once. On the other hand, alternate activation has a more tactical feel, and that's because as play goes back and forth between the players, plans will adapt based on what the enemy is doing and unexpected events that arise. So this is a perfect example of you as a games designer being faced with 2 branching paths and having to choose which one is the right one for your game. And this is one of the first things to decide, because the turn structure, the turn sequence, really shapes everything else in your wargame. But don't worry, in the second half of this video we're going to look at how to approach situations like this where you need to decide between 2 options. For now, let's just push on to the second core part of any wargame, and that is combat. Now, when I say combat, I don't just mean your attack sequence, e.g. rolling dice to see how much damage you do. Fundamentally, all war games are about opposing units maneuvering and destroying each other. So I consider this a broad area that covers the real crunch of your core rules. How do units move, shoot, and fight? And immediately we can see how the turn sequence we decide might shape this. If you have distinct phases, a move phase, a shoot phase, and so on, do units get to make one action in each phase, or do you have a pool of actions a unit can draw from and a set number of action points they need to spend? This area does of course also cover the actual attack sequence. How do units swing swords and shoot guns? How do units deal damage to one another? Is it a series of steps, hit roll, wound roll, save roll, damage, like in 40k and AOS? Or does it use something like a dice pool system instead, or perhaps opposed rolls between players? Lastly, I think there are lots of spectrums or sliders that a wargame sits upon. And when designing a wargame, it can be good to think about where you want your wargame to sit on each of those spectrums or sliders. For example, where would your wargame sit on a simulation versus game slider? Is your wargame more of a simulation with rules aimed at realism? I'm thinking of things like scattering explosive blasts, vehicles having different armor values on their front and rear, rules to represent weather effects, fatigue, morale, etc. Or is it more of a game in the truest sense, with meta currencies such as command points and game objects such as playing cards? Another slider or spectrum is the scale of conflict. Here I'm not necessarily talking about the size of miniatures, although that will have a lot of bearing, but if we take Kill Team, 40k and Apocalypse as an example, all use the same size miniatures, but the scale of conflict is wildly different. If you're making a skirmish game with just a dozen miniatures aside, will it be granular enough to track individual injuries, perhaps going as far as giving different body parts their own hit points like an Inquisitor? Will it track ammunition at all? Perhaps just for certain guns, like the assault cannon in Space Hulk. On the other end of the scale, if it's a mass battle game, are individual models removed as casualties, or does the unit remain intact until enough damage is done to remove it entirely, like in Kings of War? So those are just two examples of what I mean when I say sliders or spectrums, and there are many, many more that we could think of. And in the second part of this video, we're going to be looking at how to place your warband on those. The third core element is list building. This covers how a player assembles their team of units for a wargame. Do players pick units using a point system, or is it predetermined, like say Warhammer Underworlds or Combat Patrol, or does it use another method entirely? If you're using a point system, how granular does it go? Are individual weapons given a cost, or will options for units instead be balanced internally against each other? If you go for fixed lists, what, if any, elements can be customized? In Spearhead, you have a fixed roster of units, but you get to choose your regiment ability and enhancement from a selection. And in fact, what makes this feature unique, at least in the Warhammer sphere, is it is chosen at the start of the game rather than before, as this allows the player to cater their army for different matchups. Next up is scenarios, or missions, or battle plans, or whatever you want to call them. This one can be easy to overlook, but it is really, really important. I cannot stress this enough because it determines one of the most fundamental things about your wargame. What must the players do to win? Is there a selection of scenarios, or do players always play the same one? In the initial release of Spearhead, for example, you always play the same scenario, with variety coming from the board you use and the cards you draw. In 2nd edition 40k, you technically always play the same scenario, but in it, each player draws a secret mission card not to be revealed until the end. On the other hand, it is very common for modern wargames to have a suite of scenarios, like in 10th edition 40k or Age of Sigmar. This allows you to cater for different styles of play. For example, tournament style gaming, called matched play, or games where storytelling takes the focus, narrative play. But that's not all there is to scenarios. Drilling down a step, is the battle resolved after a set number of turns, say 5 rounds? Or does play continue until one player meets a certain criteria, scoring X number of victory points or routing the enemy army? Does scoring and events change from turn to turn perhaps? Is there an underdog system to help the loser make a dramatic reversal towards the end? If so, what does it look like? How big is your battlefield? 6 foot by 4 foot? 3 foot by 3 foot? How far away does each player's force start from the other? And what effect does this have on movement values and the range of weapons? As you can see, there are so many aspects to consider when it comes to scenarios, which makes this one of the most important parts of designing a wargame, so make sure you give it the attention it deserves. Now on to the last part, setting. The setting is the background of your game. Who is fighting and why? Is it the grim darkness of the far future, or is it dueling wizards out in the frozen wastes? I put this one last on the list because wargames might be historical, or they might be setting agnostic. Generic fantasy perhaps, or generic sci-fi. But I think even in those cases it is still a fundamental part of a wargame that must be considered. And this is because when I say the setting is one of the core parts, I'm not really talking about the act of writing the background or of world building, but of how it bleeds into your game's design. Are the spells your wizards can cast generic like Fireball, or specific like Melf's Acid Arrow? Is Napoleon a playable unit? If so, what do his characteristics look like? Are win conditions derived from the setting? Is there a specific resource everyone covets like Weirdstone in Mordheim, or minerals and Vespane gas in StarCraft? Do your factions have asymmetry that's born out of the setting, like the fact that Tau have no psychers, or Khorne hates magic? The setting fills in the cracks of all the other core parts, and it brings one of the most critical elements, which is theme. Now let's look at the last part, the optional sixth, and that is campaigns. A campaign is a system for linking your battles together. Rather than each battle being a standalone affair like a Call of Duty deathmatch, instead each battle affects the one after it like an RPG. Now wargames don't need a campaign to function, and there are lots that don't have one. But if you do include a campaign, you'll need to decide if it is a central pillar of play or not. Is the campaign system going to be the expected way to play, like in Necromunda, or optional, like Crusade in 40k? On the other hand, it could be something not present at all, like in Warhammer Underworlds. We've established the 5 core parts of any wargame and an optional 6th. So a great place to start is to begin writing up notes for each of these 5 or 6 areas. How will your wargame deliver on them? And it's really important that you consider every aspect here. I keep mentioning scenarios. Don't leave scenarios as an afterthought. It's how you win your game. It's super important. Having a detailed plan for each of these sections is going to turn the experience of writing a wargame, as I like to say, from Dark Souls to Elden Ring. If you've played both, you'll know the big difference with Elden Ring is when the game is kicking your ass, because unlike the others, it is open world, you can just go somewhere else for a bit. Same here. When you get stuck, having a plan for each area will give you somewhere else to direct your attention rather than repeatedly slamming into a wall. And this in turn should help you overcome areas where you are stuck. For example, you might be stuck on designing combat. In shifting your focus over to list building for a bit, you might figure out all the different weapons you want players to be able to equip their units with, and this in turn might help you when you next return to the combat rules, as it gives you fuel to design the special abilities and levers you need to differentiate each of those weapons from each other. But once you go ahead and start planning these sections, there is a question that you are going to run into very quickly. And it is the second question that I posed at the start of this video. How do I know if a mechanic is right or not for my wargame? And I'll quickly add here that when I say mechanic, I'm talking about basically any aspect of your game. I'm talking about big overarching things like the turn sequence, should your game use I go, you go, alternate activation or something else. And I'm also talking about the details. Should grenades misfire? Should grenades be something in the game at all, or should they just be omitted? Should spells require a casting roll like Age of Sigmar, or should they just be automatically cast like in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? There is thousands of decisions like this, and you as the games designer will constantly have to weigh up 2 approaches against one another and decide which one better suits your game. So how do you do that? Well, you could just choose based on your preferences, but in doing so, you run the risk of creating Homer's car, a mess of features that appeals to no one but yourself. Or to say it another way, a game with an unclear vision. So to answer this question, what we're going to do now is look at creating your game's vision. And I'm going to show you the vision for my wargame, Black Death City, in the process. Now, it's fine for you to already have a few mechanics in mind before you set out a game's vision. I think for most people, that initial inspiration, that desire to create a wargame, will come with a few mechanics that they have in mind that they would like to use. And you'll see that with Black Death City in a moment. I already have a few mechanics penciled in, even before I've created the game's vision. But that being said, creating a solid vision for your game is something that you should aim to do as quickly as possible. And that is because once you have a vision for your game, it can serve as a metric. And with that, we can start answering the second question. How do I know if a mechanic is right for my wargame? Well, does it align with your game's vision or not? So this is part 2, and in this section of the video, we're going to put together a document that details your game's vision. It will be something that we can refer to during planning and beyond, and its critical functions are to set direction and to be used as an ongoing metric to evaluate future mechanics. I think the actual content of the document can take any shape or form as long as it fulfills those functions. It could just be a single page that outlines your vision, or it could be a lengthy document that goes into great detail. I'm not going to say that my approach is the only way or even the best way, but feel free to make your document as close to mine as you wish. That being said, I think the shorter you can make it, the better, and that's for 2 reasons. The first is if you ever need to share this with other people, perhaps you can have other people collaborating on your game or working on it as well. Keeping it short means that it will not overwhelm them. But even if working on the game is a solo project, as is the case for me, keeping it short keeps it focused and to the point. So for that reason, I'm going to be using Google Slides or PowerPoint to create my document, because I think programs like those encourage brevity. And I'm going to keep it to around 5 or 6 slides in total. Now, to get the ball rolling, we need a starting point. And for me, a great starting point is as follows. What's the elevator pitch for your game? As in, sell me this pen. Tell me in 100 words or so what your game is about and why it is cool. I gave it some thought, and here's mine for Black Death City. Black Death City is a world of dark fantasy and gothic horror. Set in the ruins of a plague-infested city, warbands of guild mercenaries, insidious ratmen, the undead, and worshippers of dark gods all wage war against one another down its darkened streets. Black Death City is a miniatures agnostic narrative skirmish wargame. It has a classic Warhammer feel with a modern twist. The heart of the game revolves around an in-depth campaign system where each battle tells the next chapter in an ongoing story, driven by the black letters players open and read as they explore the city in search of glory and fortune. Alright, so that's 105 words, and hopefully it's enough to get you both excited about the game, but also give you a clear idea of what an elevator pitch could look like. And that is going to form the first slide in my vision document. I might tweak this pitch later, but for now it serves its purpose, which is to tell you as much about the game as quickly as possible. I am sure you probably have a good idea of what sort of game Black Death City is going to be after hearing that, both in its setting and gameplay. I've also hinted at one of the upcoming mechanics, the black letters, which will form an integral part of the campaign. Like I said, it's okay for you to have some mechanics in mind before you start outlining the vision for your game. But don't expect me to explain what the black letters are in this video. That's a secret for another time.
All right then, keep your secrets.
Okay, so this is a good starting point, but what's next? There are a few phrases in here that need more explanation. What do I mean by a classic Warhammer feel with a modern twist? Without any explanation, it is just a load of marketing speak, a load of hot air. So the next step is to start plucking out these phrases and buzzwords and expanding upon them in more detail. I would encourage you to do the same. If you've used descriptive words like immersive, tactical, nail-biting, narratively rich, or anything else in that vein, these are the sort of words to pick out and expand upon. And if you've mentioned specific mechanics, these are great things to pick up on too. And each time we expand on one of these, we're going to do so on a new slide, and that in turn is going to create the vision document as a whole. So for me, the slides that I could make from that initial pitch are classic Warhammer with a modern twist, in-depth campaign system, the black letters, dark fantasy, and gothic horror. To begin with, let's look at classic Warhammer with a modern twist and see how I can expand upon it. I want Black Death City to pay homage to its roots. I want it to be a love letter to my favourite wargames, which are the Warhammer games of the 90s. You can see that in the setting of the game. While not an exact one-for-one, the plague-infested city, which as of now isn't going to have a name, it's just the city, pays homage to one game in particular. But it's not just the setting. Where I envisage this game sitting next to those old Warhammer games is somewhere similar to where the OSR sits in relation to early editions of Dungeons & Dragons. For those not in role-playing game circles who may not be aware, there is a big movement in the indie role-playing game scene called OSR, or Old School Renaissance. And what it sets out to do is recapture the feeling of early Dungeons & Dragons. You see, modern D&D is often about these big sweeping narratives and of epic characters who become powerful enough to challenge the very gods. But early D&D was about the dungeon more than the dragon, and OSR games seek to recapture that spirit, that feeling of exploring a dungeon and not knowing what is going to be around the next corner. Life and death hangs in the balance, all in the pursuit of a few gold coins. And I want Black Death City to fill a similar niche in wargaming. So it's not just going to be its setting that resonates with those older games, it's going to be its gameplay too. I want players to feel like they are playing a 90s Warhammer game when they play my game, but with a few modern sensibilities added in. I'm not going full retro. So if I'm going to make this a core part of my game's vision, and if I'm going to start using this as a metric to evaluate if a mechanic is right for my game or not, I really need to define what I mean by a classic Warhammer feel. For me, classic Warhammer is 90s Warhammer. It's 4th and 5th edition fantasy battle, 2nd edition 40k. It is Necromunda, Gorkamorka and Mordheim. It is Warhammer Quest, Space Hulk and 3rd edition Blood Bowl. And for me it has characteristics that separate it both from true old Hammer of the 80s. It's not as messy and gnarly as things like Realm of Chaos. And it also has stark differences to the Warhammer that came after it. Both the middle Hammer of the 2000s and the modern Hammer, which starts with 8th edition 40k and Age of Sigmar, so 2015 onwards. You might think that Warhammer games have been roughly the same over the years because they've always used I go, you go, or hit, wound and save for attacking. But let me tell you, Warhammer has changed a lot. Over the last few years in my free time, the 2 editions of 40k I've played the most is 10th edition and 2nd edition. I like them both, but playing them side by side is night and day. As much as I like playing the modern games, for Black Death City, I want a classic Warhammer feel. So what is classic Warhammer gameplay then? What elements does it have that sets it apart from the modern games? The first is something called emergent play. In classic Warhammer, the unpredictable happens. Straight away, we can think about things like scattering blast templates as a great example of this. Heavy weapons, such as missile launchers and cannons, had a blast radius represented by a template. And every time it missed, it didn't just disappear, it landed somewhere else, determined by rolling a scatter dice. A mechanic like this leads to a massive amount of variance in what could happen. Would the blast scatter onto an empty field? Would it land on your own troops and cause friendly fire? Would it scatter further into enemy lines and work out even better? Or would you also roll a misfire and have the blast centered back on the firer? But I am not making the case here just for blast weapons and scattering in particular. In fact, I'm still undecided if Black Death City will feature templates or not. I'm just giving it as a first example of a mechanic that creates emergent play through the unpredictable, and the older editions were full of these sorts of mechanics. I'm talking about guns misfiring and jamming, vehicles having parts of them explode and fly off in random directions, or vehicles going out of control and careening across the battlefield, weapons flinging enemies in random directions, or causing them to go crazy before their heads explode. Weird and wacky damage effects such as orc scorchers having to keep moving after their fuel tanks are hit to stop them meeting a fiery demise, or about the gunner in an Elder Viper trying to clamber across the canopy to take over the seat of the dead driver before the skimmer crashes into the building. And it wasn't about any one of these rules in particular, it was the fact that they crisscrossed each other and were all connected. The random damage on vehicles in Warhammer 40k 2nd edition meant the drivers had a chance of getting shot, which in turn meant vehicles could go out of control, which in turn meant they might run over your own troops, which in turn could force you to shoot your own vehicle to stop it in its tracks. This gives rise to what video games designers like to call emergent play. Zelda Breath of the Wild and its many connected systems is an excellent example of this. So emergent play is one of the hallmarks of classic Warhammer and something almost entirely missing from the modern game. What surprising things can happen in 10th edition 40k? A tank exploding on the roll of a 6, that's about it. In classic Warhammer, things are unpredictable and things go wrong, and I love it because it produces some of the most memorable moments in wargaming. So when I say I want a classic Warhammer feel, the first part of that is emergent play. The second hallmark for me is something I'm going to call war as simulation. And here I'm thinking about one of the sliders I talked about earlier. Where does your game fall on a slider between simulation and game? Which is it trying to be first and foremost? When reading the rules in the 90s, I always felt like they were translating a living and breathing world into rules form, rather than trying to be a game first and foremost. And that is something I would like to recapture in Black Death City as well. So for me, that is the lack of meta currencies like command points, a lack of static aura abilities like being +1 to hit when you're next to someone just for reasons, and it's thinking about how to incorporate immersive elements such as the weather, morale, or weapons misfiring. And many of these simulationist style rules also work to encourage emergent play. Think about how in Space Hulk there is a chance your Terminator's Stormbolter will jam every time it is fired in Overwatch. Not only does it add a simulationist feel, it is another layer of realism, it also adds to the emergent play by introducing a tension building dice roll every time the Gene Stealer moves a step closer. It adds an element of unpredictability that can shape the game. So what I do is I take this phrase and I populate a second slide in my document with its definition, explaining both emergent play and war as simulation. Now, hopefully, we can start to see how I can use this as a metric. For example, will spells require a casting roll in Black Death City? Most certainly, yes. And on top of that, it will likely have rules for failing a cast so badly it goes horribly wrong and the wizard kills themselves in the process. And it might even have rules for a critical cast, where the spell goes off with an enhanced effect if you roll really high. This aligns with the vision of my game because this will help promote emergent play with a variety of outcomes that are difficult to predict. So now we've defined what I mean by classic Warhammer feel in my pitch. However, you may recall that I added a caveat. I said with a modern twist. This is not going to be a retro clone. So what do I mean by modern twist? The next step now is to define that in the same way. Right now, this is just another buzzword. It's more marketing speak. To turn it into a usable metric, we need to provide some clarity. So in 90s Warhammer, the rules were often written with simulation in mind first and foremost, and I like this approach, and it's an approach that I want for Black Death City. However, there are times when this leads to madness-inducing rules. My favorite example of this is the jump packs in 2nd edition 40k. Here are the rules for them in all their glory. Not only did they have convoluted rules about how the height of the terrain impacted the length of the move to try and accurately plot the jump the Marine was making, but upon landing you had to scatter the wearer d3 inches. And by that I don't mean the squad moves d3 inches in a random direction like in Deep Strike. I mean every single Space Marine individually scatters. And there's even more nonsense about models landing on top of each other, which happens all the time in a 10-man squad, and even rules for taking initiative tests to avoid hurting yourself when crashing into terrain. It is a nightmare, and it takes ages to resolve because you have to roll the scatter dice one at a time, and ultimately it accomplishes very, very little. So these are the sort of rules I really want to avoid. In my Inquisitor video, I made a distinction between something I coined as crunchy inputs versus crunchy outputs. The idea here is every mechanic in a wargame is made up of two parts, the input and the output, and either side of these can be crunchy or streamlined. A crunchy input is something that takes a long time to resolve and might incorporate things like tables of modifiers or reference charts. A streamlined input is something quick to resolve. On the other end, a crunchy output is something with a variety of outcomes or that can lead to a lot of different board states, whereas a streamlined output would be something linear or binary, success or fail. So when I say I am a fan of crunchy rules, I specifically mean crunchy outputs. The sort of rules I want for Black Death City are those that are very elegant to resolve, i.e. they have a streamlined input, but they can lead to detailed and unpredictable board states, i.e. they have a crunchy output. This jump pack rules is the opposite of what I want. This is loads and loads of tedious dice rolling that amounts to nothing ultimately. So while rules like this feel like classic Warhammer, to me it's not in a good way, and these are the sorts of rules I want to avoid. So what is an example of a streamlined input with a crunchy output? For me, a good one is the aforementioned jamming rules in Space Hulk. And I think this one is a good one because when I say crunchy output, it doesn't mean everything has to be a roll on a table of effects. That's a trick that you should use sparingly if you can, because if you use it too much, then in itself it will become tedious to resolve as you spend time navigating books, flicking through pages and pages of tables. The jamming rule in Space Hulk creates a crunchy output not through rolling on a table, but instead through how often it occurs, and as a result how it can shape the game with its unpredictability and lead to many different board states. Making the dice roll itself is very simple. In fact, it happens as part of the natural shooting roll, so there is nothing extra you need to do. In Space Hulk, shooting a Storm Bolter is a 2-dice roll, 1 for each barrel, and if either dice rolls a 6, the Genestealer is killed. When you fire on Overwatch, which means when you fire to interrupt the Genestealer's move, there is a twist. If you roll a double, the weapon jams. It's a very simple and elegant input, but because 90% of your Terminators are armed with this weapon, it is a mechanic that has a real impact, as it can affect anywhere on the map at any time, and means in every game a few of the Storm Bolters are going to jam at some point. You cannot predict where, and a skilled player is going to need to adapt their plans on the fly. I love rules like this, and these are the sorts of rules I want to emulate in Black Death City. Simple, elegant, narrative rules that can lead the game down unpredictable paths. And not to mention, this rule is just so immersive and cinematic. It's so much fun to imagine a Terminator having his gun jam right as the Genestealer closes in. So the next slide in our document is set aside to define what we mean by modern twists. And from here, hopefully you can see how I am turning that initial elevator pitch, those 100 or so words about my game, into a document that both sets direction for my game and can start to be used as a metric to evaluate other potential mechanics. You can continue this process as many times as you like, expanding upon different phrases in your pitch and laying down your vision in the process. Not everything needs to come from that initial pitch, however. If you have ideas for other slides that come from elsewhere, feel free to add them. I myself recently have been thinking about what makes a Sam Pearson wargame, if there is such a thing, or at least what sort of thoughts would I like to conjure up in people when they hear that a game has been designed by me. So I looked back on everything that I've made to date and I settled on 2 things. The first is a focus on natural English rather than too much rules jargon. I spoke on this briefly in my Warcry video, that I was inspired by the natural English of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition when writing Warcry, and tried to write sentences using clean, unambiguous English in a way a 10-year-old could understand. My hands were tied in certain places. For example, the rune marks of Warcry were added to solve a production issue. We needed non-language fighter cards, and that made the rules more complicated than I would have otherwise liked, but generally I felt the rules were written in a way that was simple and elegant. That doesn't mean I won't use jargon. I think things like keywords are incredibly useful. It just means I won't overload sentences with jargon or awkward phrasing. Not to throw another game under the bus, but I would never write my game like Kill Team, for example, especially the previous edition with all the random shapes. Kill Team is a very fun game to play, but it's not fun to read the rules in my opinion, although with its latest edition it has gotten a lot better in that regard. So that's the first element that I would like to capture as a Sam Pearson feel. The second is the inclusion of underdog mechanics and negative feedback loops. This is something I have spoken about many times on the channel now and cover in depth in my Spearhead video. Link in the description below and also at the end of this video. I want Black Death City to allow for dramatic reversals where David suddenly fells Goliath, and I'm going to do this through baking in negative feedback loops and underdog mechanics wherever possible. So here we have 2 examples of things that didn't feel right to include in the pitch. I'm not trying to sell you on those things specifically, but they make up a really important part of my game's vision, so I needed to include a slide dedicated to them. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead now to one final step that you can do to finish off your vision document, and that is to create 5 or 6 design tenets. What are design tenets? They are short, snappy sentences that underpin a key part about your game's vision and your design philosophy. We do this for 2 reasons. The first is, as short as we've tried to make the vision document, it could always be shorter. These design tenets will be catchy and memorable. You can stick them on a piece of paper, print it out and place it on your wall, so it's always in your field of vision whilst you're working. There is a second reason, and that's where the design tenets really shine, in my opinion. The second reason is the ranking matters. We're going to create 5 design tenets about our game, and then we're going to rank them in order of importance. And that doesn't mean the bottom one won't be important. Far from it. It forms a core part of the game's vision like all the others, and we will try our best to hit every design tenet as often as we can. However, there will be times when you'll want to bend or even break parts of your vision, and this will allow you to do so. But there is a catch. You can only break a design tenet if it's in service of one of the others above it. And before we dive in, I need to quickly give credit for this system. This is something I first encountered when working on Age of Sigmar's current edition, 4th edition. The lead rules writer, Matt Rose, was incredibly inspiring to work under, and one of the things Matt did was create design tenets for Age of Sigmar that we as a team followed, and it gave us the tools to evaluate rules not just for ourselves when working on a design, but it also enabled us as a team to have really structured debates regarding if a rule was right for the game or not. So these tenets are 5 snappy sentences, each trying to underpin a key part of the game's vision and design philosophy, and they are ranked in order of importance so that when push comes to shove, I can break one of the lower ones in service of one of the higher ones. And to have a little bit of fun with this, I'm also going to do some world building. I'm going to make these in-world idioms. That is, as well as these design tenets being expressions to guide me in my rules writing, they are going to be 5 in-world phrases the characters of Black Death City would all know. They are things the grizzled mercenary would mutter to the new lad who's joined up and needs to be shown the ropes. So this is going to double up as a little bit of world building. Remember, I said the setting is something that bleeds into everything else in your game and gives it its theme. Well, let me try and show that in action here. So now I present to you the 5 truths of the city. Battles are fought with blood and smoke. Powder misfires, sorcery devours. The law of the sword is simple, yet its consequences are not. The city hungers for hubris. The city is a dark and dangerous place. So those are my 5 design tenets, but they're also trying to be in-world idioms. So let's break down each one by one. So the first one, battles are fought with blood and smoke. This one speaks to war as a simulation that I talked about earlier. I want the rules to convey a feeling of grit and verisimilitude. I am not going to focus on board gamey style mechanics if I can help it. For example, I am not going to have a command point system for activating abilities or stratagems. If there is something a fighter should be able to do, like inspire his fellows, there won't be a meta currency to activate it. Instead, it will take the form of a willpower test or something that measures the success against the character themselves and thusly feels a bit more real. Powder misfires, sorcery devours. This is a phrase the inhabitants of the city use to say stuff goes wrong, prepare for the unexpected, make contingency plans, and don't practice magic if you want to live a long life. In design terms, this one is about creating emergent gameplay elements through the unpredictable. The law of the sword is simple, yet its consequences are not. In world, this one speaks of the martial law that governs Black Death City. Here is a lawless place except for the rule of the sword which men live and die by. But I can imagine this phrase being said to cover the messy situations that arise from it. The consequences are things like blood feuds and grudges between the rival warbands that arise. Design-wise, this is about capturing elegance, both in the way the rules are written, but also in the inputs of every mechanic. I want rules to be simple to resolve, but the second part alludes to the outputs. I want rules to be elegant, but with crunchy and cinematic outcomes that can send the battle down a myriad of branching paths. Here we can really see the hierarchy take shape. I want the game to feel realistic and I want the unpredictable to happen, but neither of those should get in the way of the game having simple and elegant rules, which is why this one sits higher. The city hungers for hubris. This is essentially an expression for the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And it is about enshrining those negative feedback loops I want and those underdog mechanics. Putting this as my second most important design tenet means it should run through almost every aspect of my game, from the scenarios right the way through to the campaign as a whole, and I will be looking everywhere I can to see where I can mitigate those death spirals and inject some negative feedback loops to keep the players in check. The city is a dark and dangerous place. Okay, this last one is a simple one that is meant to capture the theme of Black Death City. For me, this is a really important one because whilst I have said the game will be miniature agnostic, I really don't want the game to feel generic. I want Black Death City to drip with theme in the same way Morkborg or Mordheim do. Putting this one first makes it the immutable law. This is the one thing that shouldn't be broken, even if it leads to some tough calls. For example, reading this, I think there's going to be no elves in this game. This is gritty dark fantasy and gothic horror. It's not going to be a place for delicate pointy-eared folk. It also reinforces to me how the theme and setting of the game must shape everything. For example, I've just said I want to have underdog mechanics in the game, ways of the loser snatching a surprise victory. But in doing so, it should never feel contrived. It should feel like a law of the universe. When warbands grow to a certain size and infamy, they have enemies lurking around every corner. Smaller warbands are able to call in favors. Maybe a wealthy patron grants them some deadly poison to use against the stronger, more infamous warbands. These are the sort of mechanics I'm searching for above all else. Things that feel born out of the setting, rather than me just granting the underdog a random bonus that breaks immersion. Right, that brings us to the end of today's video. It was a long one, but I hope you have found it useful. We looked at the 5 or 6 core parts every wargame needs, and then we looked at how to establish a cohesive vision for your game. Starting with an elevator pitch of just 100 words, then expanding upon that into a whole document, and then finishing with 5 catchy design tenets to live by. Now, there are some bits I have to leave off the table. The video was getting quite long, so if there is anything you would like me to expand upon in a later video, please let me know down in the comments below. As mentioned, this is the first video in a new series where I will be showcasing the development of Black Death City, but the videos are not going to be back to back. I'm going to sprinkle in other videos in between. In the next video in this series, we're going to delve into the actual crunch of rules writing. We're going to be looking at the combat of Black Death City, and I'm going to be referring to the game's vision time and time again in those later videos, showing just how important it was today to lay down that foundation. And ultimately, I hope you find this a useful tool in making your own wargame as well, or at least you found it entertaining to hear me talk about it. And what about Black Death City? Are you excited by what you've heard so far? How do you think the black letters in the campaign will work? All will be revealed in the next few months, of course, but don't let me stop you from speculating. Until then, expect another video sooner rather than later. The next one is going to be a deep dive into classic Necromunda, my favourite wargame of all time. Please remember to like and subscribe the video, leave a comment down below what you thought about it, and if you've got some spare hype points, I'd love it if you could hype this video. We recently reached 10,000 subscribers. It's a great milestone. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. Now, I did promise an AMA when we reach 10,000 subscribers, so I'll have to start preparing for that soon. Follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky if you want to see what's on my painting desk. Link to my socials down in the box below. Otherwise, until next time, bye for now.